question 1, is there a particular instance or event that affirmed for you the importance of recognizing commonalities among struggles and the intersection of systems of oppression?
I first began thinking about the intersectionality of women's rights, animal rights, sexism, speciesism, just by virtue of my experience as a woman in the patriarchal world. So feeling objectified just walking down the street because maybe, I'm wearing a skirt, it's hot out, people can see my legs, oh my gosh, and all of a sudden I'm treated like a piece of meat. And so I began thinking about that. But what really got me doing research on my own time was getting sick, and very sick. I was bedridden for a while, and every time I did go out, and this was after like maybe a month and a half of just being in bed, I had to be in a wheelchair. And having been not necessarily healthy earlier, but having been mostly able-bodied before, the differences in how I was treated were striking and disturbing. I went from being, a woman who was objectified, but was, largely privileged as a young white woman who adheres to stereotypes of beauty, at least in the Western world, to being somebody who was gawked at, who was considered freakish, who now was experiencing sexism and ableism. I remember this one instance in particular where I was on campus. I go to Ryerson, and I was using my cane at this point, and a guy yelled at me, "You're too pretty for that." And that, to me, really summed up the intersectionality between sexism and ableism. Because for him, I was an object to be gawked at, to be looked at, to be enjoyed, but I couldn't be enjoyed in the way that he wanted because I wasn't able-bodied. And that, made me really start thinking about ableism as something that is entrenched and crucial to our society. One phrase that I think we have all been guilty of at one point or another, which again for me really displays the importance of understanding commonalities between ableism and speciesism, is when we say that we are speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves. We say this all the time in regards to non-human animals. I only stopped using this phrase a few months ago because I realized that it's also a phrase that is used in regards to people with disabilities, especially when those disabilities are cognitive. The allies will say, they can't speak for themselves, so I'm standing up for them. And this is problematic because both non-human persons and persons with disabilities, regardless of whether they have the use of language or not, are communicating. They are speaking for themselves. I go to vigils with Toronto Pig Save regularly, and I have heard the pigs scream. You can't tell me that that's not language, that that's not communication, that that's not a voice. And the same goes for persons with disabilities. I have connected with a few people via the internet who are entirely paralyzed and they cannot speak. But they use some sort of technological device that I can't pretend to understand, but they do, to communicate via the internet. And all of a sudden I'm having these really intense discussions about ableism, and they have told me about experiences when they were stuck in the hospital for months and no one tried to communicate with them, even though they were trying themselves in their own way. And this, to me, was the moment where I realized that disabled persons are treated like animals, and that is because animals are not considered to be persons. And thus, by this comparison, disabled people are no longer considered to be persons. So that's really what solidified it for me, was this idea of speaking for those who do not have voices.
It's basically, the short answer is no. There's no one instance for me. I would say that there's a lifetime of experience that led me to making these connections. And I think that the experience is the fundamental element. So knowledge is important, and I think experience behind that is essential. So people explain to me, you can explain to a person all sorts of things. I think of the people on the A side, and I sometimes ask myself, how can somebody who is exclusively on the A side understand, when for me, the root of my understanding is having known oppression and prejudice on several levels and for several reasons. I don't know. I don't know how you can get there when you haven't got some direct experience. There must be a way, and I'm sure there is, and I'd love to hear somebody talk about that sometime. But for me, starting with experience and then being fed ideas and going, wow, oh yeah, of course. And it took a long time. I wasn't quick on the uptake. I think I'm still, I learn all the time. The knowledge is important, but again, without the experience, and not any one, but a lot of different experience. It's built a platform from which I can start connecting the dots.
What would you say to people who are just becoming more active as community organizers or activists, who may be working to broaden their analysis from a single issue to intersecting issues? Can you recommend any resources or useful steps for us to take?
Okay, so I have, my answer is in regard to being an ally, just because this is something that I've been engaging in discussions about recently, so it's on my mind. I think in being an ally, there are two crucial things that you must do, and I have learned this through mistakes of my own. The first, which I have noted has been a theme throughout this whole discussion that we're having, is listening, and really actively listening. That means not sitting there and waiting for the person to finish so you can say your opinion. It means trying to push aside all of the biases that you have, all the thoughts that you have, the agendas that you have, to just listen with an open mind. And I know that is difficult. I personally am very guilty of sometimes getting very angry and distressed, particularly about animal rights issues, or if I've had a day where I've experienced a lot of harassment, ableist harassment, I get really angry. And then all of a sudden I have this agenda that I need to push. Everyone who's not vegan, I just don't have the patience to hear why. I don't care. And that is not effective. No matter, like go take a breath, go scream in a pillow, I've done that. And then listen to why they think they cannot be vegan. You might learn something, as difficult as that might be. The second thing I would recommend, and I've learned this through feminist discussions, is number one, recognize your privileges. So I, for example, have white privilege. For a while, I had the privilege of being a thin, appearing able-bodied woman, so I adhered to beauty standards. Etc. So once you recognize that, do something with it. And what a number of feminists that I've been talking to have suggested is, as opposed to going into these communities, so as opposed to you as a non-disabled person going into a disabled community and listening, that is really important. But what I would argue is almost more important is after you've had these discussions, you've done your own research, going into your own privileged community and creating a space there. And this is especially relevant for male feminists. I find often men feel, like they don't have a space in feminist conversations, since a lot of them are for women only, often for reasons of safety. And they get frustrated by this. And a response that a lot of feminists have come up with is, well, you have a lot of privilege, you have a lot of spaces that are already allotted for you, so go into those spaces and then bring in your activism, then bring in your feminism, and that is really helpful and crucial, and that is being an ally. Lastly, as a quick note, I would recommend, if one has access to a computer and the internet, and I recognize that this is not feasible for people for a number of reasons, but if you do, try and join online forums. I find these especially helpful and effective because you get lots of voices, lots of different opinions coming from different circumstances, and you really see intersectionality coming into play as a result. So just even like scrolling through these discussions and reading them without actively participating, you can learn a lot. So yeah, those would be my suggestions for people who are just starting to get into this stuff.
I guess the first thing I should say for someone just coming into intersectionality is thank you. Thank you for coming there. Thank you for trying. Thank you for joining. It's going to take a lot of people to slowly bring any kind of change, and I think that should be our first response. It certainly is my first response. I think that we have to remember that it's a process. That you're never done, you're never there, and that you have to be patient, both with yourself and with others. Nothing happens overnight. And I know that the things I've learned in my many years of activism aren't of much use to anyone else. It isn't like I can help you avoid kind of blundering that I've done. I think that life is kind of that way. We always assume we can just tell young people and they won't make that stupid mistake. Yeah, right. It just doesn't work that way. So understanding that's important. And I guess another thing I would say that's really important to me, please, as part of that patience, don't attack others, don't be negative, don't criticize, that it takes such tremendous strength to be in this movement, and demoralizing each other is just, it's the wrong approach. The final thing that I'd say is, as a philosopher, studying Asian philosophy has been hugely helpful to me, working in this field. The Buddhist idea, actually, I always come back, it goes back to Hinduism, not only of ahimsa, but of life being suffering and of the oneness of all. It helps give me the acceptance to deal with the things, my own blunders and any unkindness I bump into. It just helps me somewhat. I mean, you can only do so much, right? You can see that I sit up here and shake. I'm uncomfortable. It's not that I'm cold, I'm nervous. I have not found people to be all that friendly, so I'm kind of uncomfortable around them. So it's not a cure-all, but it certainly helps me.